Okay, well, I think we've got a fair number of participants coming through now, which is lovely. On behalf of the Royal Society of Chemistry and the Royal Society, I'd like to welcome everyone who's joining us today for this webinar, which is working together to address the barriers for disabled scientists. And also, happy Disability History Month, everyone. That's just started as well, so very timely for us now in November. So my name is Elise Cartmell, and I'm the chair of the Royal Society of Chemistry, Inclusion and Diversity Committee, and also a member of the Board of Trustees. And for me, some of the most positive and powerful memories of my career are related to being in Edinburgh University's undergraduate chemistry laboratory, and for the first time experiencing the thrill of trying, not always successfully, I hasten to add, to synthesize and analyze materials and working with the most amazing equipment. Unfortunately, not everyone has equal access to these experiences. So science should be welcoming and accessible to everyone. But all too often, the experiences of disabled scientists and students are shaped by stigma and discrimination. Today, I'm really pleased to chair this webinar, which features brilliant members of the scientific community whose work has been pivotal to leading change in disability inclusion in science. The agenda's up on the screen here, and please ask questions in the Q&A function, which is just down at the bottom of your screen. And we do have quite a busy agenda, but we'll do our best to try and answer some of the questions at the end of the presentations. Also, just to say, the webinar is recorded and it will be made available on both of the Society's web pages shortly, alongside the reports that we'll be talking about today. So, disabled scientists are underrepresented across the academic and industrial sectors, and it has been a strategic priority for both the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Chemistry to understand and tackle the barriers disabled scientists face, so as to ensure that science can be accessible to everyone. To start this webinar, I just want to spend a few minutes to explain why this work is important and what the current landscape is for disabled scientists. And that's really what's brought about both the organisations to embark on this research. So, how do we understand disability? Well, disability is an umbrella term which encompasses many different health conditions, impairments and differences. The umbrella of disability covers any of these which impacts on a person's day-to-day life, including sensory and mobility impairments, neurodivergence, mental health conditions, and chronic illness. The social model says that the condition of disability arises within particular environments. It refers to the ways that socially constructed barriers are disabling towards people with impairments or differences. The social model therefore highlights the importance of addressing societal structures and attitudes to create an inclusive and accessible environment for everyone. And from our perspective, is the most useful as it's focused on designing interventions to remove barriers and promote equality for disabled scientists. A little bit of background statistics now. The Royal Society of Chemistry in 2022 completed a member survey, and that demonstrated the diversity of experience within the disabled chemistry community. Long-term health conditions and mental health conditions were the most frequently chosen answers, when we asked members to indicate which best described their disability or long-term health condition or impairment. And also, there's some really useful information from the Higher Educational Statistical Agency as well, which, from 2023, about 19% of undergraduate students declared a disability, but that this number had actually decreased for postgraduate research students. So just moving to the next slide, looking specifically at chemistry, one of the most notable findings comes from last year's member survey, where just 8% of members said that they self-identified as a disabled person, but when asked if they faced barriers or limitations relating to a disability or long-term health condition or impairment, this number actually increased to 13%. This difference is representative of a more general gap between those whose experiences can be described as a disability and those who choose to self-identify as disabled. And this, of course, has a huge impact on career progression and retention of disabled talent. So further analysis of the HESA data showed that in UK universities, there is actually a huge drop-off of chemists with a known disability at each career stage. This is from undergraduate to, say, academic staff roles. So although the data is complex and how people identify does play a part, we can still clearly see this leaky pipeline effect for disabled chemists in academia. Also, in addition, a recent pay and reward survey from the Royal Society of Chemistry shows that disabled chemists are paid less compared to non-disabled chemists. So these findings are a key indicator that we are losing disabled talent at all stages of chemistry careers, and where disabled individuals are able to remain in chemistry, they are not equally rewarded. So this has very much motivated the Royal Society of Chemistry Inclusion and Diversity team and committee to embark on a project focused on understanding what the experiences of disabled chemists working in a lab are. And if we just move to the next slide, I'll just go over a little bit about what was included in the work that we'll be presenting today. So the project was called Disability-Inclusive Chemistry Laboratories, and it started last year with the aim to understand the current landscape of disability inclusivity in chemistry labs, and also showcase practical adaptations and solutions which we can do now to improve lab accessibility for chemists with varying diverse experiences. And for me, that's really important that we can get going with recommendations and actions now. So the findings from the work have been intended to inform, encourage, equip laboratory users, both in academic and industrial sectors, and then feed into a knowledge bank to improve support for disabled lab users, and also influence a culture change towards anticipatory inclusion. So the research is targeted to all lab users, and the inputs for it have been collected from a survey, from case studies which have been submitted, and also interviews which have been completed. We did get a large response and engagement from the community, which has been inspiring as to how, the positive areas that are happening now. And it also showcases just how important and timely this research is. So just to move into a little bit about the current state of disability inclusion in chemistry. So from an analysis of the research findings, the respondents that were involved really noted that a lot of value is added to the scientific knowledge by the work and discovery of disabled students, and we've got to be able to maximise that. Progress has been made in recent years towards improving disability inclusion, either through practical applications or different types of technology, but there's a lot more to be done. And COVID, which brought about widespread adoption of remote working practices, i.e., remote access to lab data, different and more flexible working hours, which disabled people had previously advocated for, have become more widespread in their adoption. So just a little bit of findings from the research to date before I pass over to our first speaker. So the findings from the research have also highlighted themed and areas for increased action. The first one is the lack of organisational guidance on disability inclusion, and in particular, a lack of proactivity from organisations to actively seek to improve accessibility and processes for requesting adjustments that are not always, and often when they are available, the guidance is not always easy to follow. Communication challenges between the employer departments are also an issue as they limit the ability to improve accessibility. Then moving to the other slides, the second theme identified was the lack of awareness of the issues that disabled scientists face in a laboratory environment. So respondents to the work who are identifying as non-disabled think there is consistency between the organisation's outward presentation towards disability inclusion and the lived experience. But in contrast, disabled respondents really, in reality, experience the opposite. Moreover, disabled individuals feel that the expectation is that they will advocate for themselves to request adjustments, which just adds an additional burden on disabled individuals. And I do think the quote that you can see here really is reflective of that. Then finally, another important finding from the research is related to experiences of bullying and harassment. So survey responses indicate that instances of bullying and harassment related to disability have unfortunately been witnessed, reported and experienced by several disabled respondents. And our findings show that if we really don't take action now, we will continue to lose talented people, and having situations where bullying and harassment is continuing is really unacceptable. So just to finish off, I wanted just to highlight some of the principles that the report provides. So the report provides a clear and practical roadmap for improving disability inclusion in the chemistry laboratories. And we'll also hear through the webinar in terms of the findings as well from the Royal Society report, and the two are very interconnected. So the Royal Society of Chemistry recommendations are grounded in the lived experiences of disabled chemists and shaped by the insights of a diverse community of contributors. And really what we're wanting to do is reimagine how labs can work better for everybody. So at the core of this transformation agenda, the report lays out 5 fundamental principles that you can see on the screen here. And these have been used to develop a total of 15 recommendations for different stakeholder groups. So I'd now like to sort of close the introduction here and pass through to the first of our speakers, who are going to give more detail in relation to both the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Chemistry's findings from the work to date. So it's absolutely super to be able to introduce Professor Paul Upchurch, who's chair of the Royal Society's Diversity and Inclusion Committee and the Disability subgroup. Paul is also a professor of paleobiology at UCL. So Paul, delighted to pass to you now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. If you could bring up my one single slide. Um, so yes, I'm going to talk to you about the Royal Society and who's been working with the open inclusion people who I particularly want to thank Julie Ellison and Julius Baker and Michelle Parfit from Open Inclusion. Fantastic set of people to work with. I always felt in the meetings with them that any points I or others raised were listened to carefully and very often acted upon. So really great collaboration there. This Open Inclusion report um, depended very heavily on disabled scientists giving up their time to have some extensive interviews over an hour per interview, and 30 disabled scientists were involved with that. And I want to thank them as well because if you read the report, you'll come across this idea of the disability tax, which is the extra time that disabled people have to spend navigating systems, dealing with barriers, um, for all sorts of reasons. And of course, that disability tax applies both in the professional life, but also in our personal lives. So this is a tax on our time that we'd otherwise spend on publishing papers and getting grants and so on. So the fact that these 30 people gave up their time to help with this report is much appreciated. And I also see that many of them have had quite difficult experiences. So some of the things which we were told must have been quite difficult for them to discuss, perhaps. So it's good that we provided a venue for that, but we also appreciate that many of these people have had a hard time, and it must have been difficult to share some of those things with us. The report itself is built on three planks. So one of them was a literature review, one of them was talking to disabled scientists, as I've already mentioned, and the third plank was essentially a series of sort of roundtable meetings with the University of York, University of East Anglia, and University of Manchester. And then there was a fourth component where people from several universities involved with line management and disability services got together. Um, Essentially, the report identified what we're calling five pillars, um, and those essentially are culture, policy, staff networks, line management, and funders. I'm not going to say too much about culture and staff networks because Hamied later will deal with those and he'll do a much better job than I can. But I would make the point that although I think it's quite a useful framework to think about these five pillars, they are heavily interconnected. You can have a fantastic set of policies from your institution, but if your local departmental culture is antagonistic, then that's not going to do you very much good as a disabled person. Um, so those things are all connected to each other, but I want to focus on saying a few words about policy, line management, and funding. So policies, of course, anyone who works for a university, etc., will know that there are regulations and policies to deal with almost any situation you can think of. And some of those obviously touch upon EDI in general and disability in particular. But the report demonstrates that there are quite a few problems with the policy landscape. One of which is signposting. I know from my own experience, it can be quite difficult to find the policies that are relevant to you as a disabled member of staff. Sometimes issues to do with disability are hidden away in policies that deal with another topic. So they deal with that topic, and then there's a little bit about, well, if you have a disability, then this can happen. So actually gathering that all together and finding that is quite tricky. Um, Good policies, though, can make a huge difference. The report argues that quite strongly. But those policies that really work for disabled people have to have been shaped by at least getting consulting and having buy-in from disabled members of staff. I think that's another. I talked about the linkages. That's where you can make an obvious link to disabled staff networks and so on. One of the policy issues that really stood out to me, though, was the idea of passports. So many of our students have, well, at UCL we call them schedules of reasonable adjustment. These are essentially agreements saying, because this person has this disability or other related health condition, whatever, they get some extra time for their essays, etc., etc. Well, some universities are starting to do this for disabled staff, and I think that's something really worth considering seriously. I certainly would like something like that in my own case. And it means if the landscape you work in changes, then you're not necessarily going back to the drawing board in terms of putting your adjustments in place. You can show to the new head of department or whatever, this is what I get. So policy is important, but it's complicated and doesn't always work to the best advantage of disabled people. Line management turns out to be a key issue, and again I know this from my own experience, and I've seen this from the other side because I've also been head of department and line managed lots of people. Um, so line management can be a great barrier if it's done badly. There's a harrowing aspect report in the open inclusion report about a disabled member of staff who was clearly the most productive person in their department, but appeared to be being held back by their line manager from promotion. But when line management works well, then it can sort of help bridge that gap between, policy, high up regulations, and your local working environment and culture. Line management offers the opportunity for flexibility and for tailoring what the disabled member of staff needs in order to work optimally. But we need to think about it from the line manager's point of view. Many of them, many of us end up in senior managerial positions because of our academic productivity, not necessarily because of our people skills. So we need to think about training for line managers, particularly with regard to disability. And if line managers get anything, it tends to be a sort of a generic EDI training for an afternoon or even sometimes less. Whereas actually, we should be thinking about what about showing line managers um, information on the social versus the medical model of disability? What about discussing the huge variety of different disabilities there are? Even in my case with visual impairment, there are lots of different types of visual impairment, anything down, from color blindness right down to total blindness. So there's a complicated landscape that we can't expect line managers to navigate by themselves. We should also be helping line managers work with disabled people because, as Elise mentioned, often the onus seems to be on disabled people to find their own solutions and to, break down the barriers themselves. Well, line managers, if they have more experience of how an institution works, have an opportunity to signpost to disabled members of staff, well, have you heard of this scheme? Are you aware that this policy exists and so on? And that could be really great. Finally, with regard to funders, funding is really important to universities. And one thing we noticed with the Research Excellence Framework, both last time and in 2029, is that the increasing emphasis on EDI is starting to have an impact. When there's money involved, people start to take things very seriously and act upon it. So funders have a big lever they can use there. And I think we're seeing some positive benefits of that. But at the same time, getting funding as a disabled person applying for grants has not been easy. A lot of online systems are not fully accessible. Short time frames between announcement of a scheme and when you have to submit your grant does not suit people with disabilities or indeed who work flexibly for other reasons. So funders are changing, and I think it's positive, but there's still a lot to be done there. I think I should probably stop there because I want to leave as much time for Q&A, either for myself or indeed at the end of the webinar as we can. But I hope that gives you an idea of what the report is about. And what we really wanted to do was not just have another piece of research that we filed away somewhere, but something that really came out with action points that people could implement.
That's super, Paul. Thank you so much. Some excellent points there. I was wondering if I could just have a bit of a chair's prerogative and ask a quick question
Mhm. Of course.
before we move on. So the last point you mentioned was around, the important role of funders. Obviously, the Royal Society plays a pivotal role in science funding. Um, are there sort of good practices that you could highlight now that's in place, perhaps with the Royal Society, and any additional further steps that you'd like to see?
Yes, so the Royal Society, like many funding bodies, I think really appreciates the importance of these issues and is working really hard on them. I think one piece of good practice, obviously, is you need to understand essentially the underlying statistics of who's applying and why they may or may not be applying. So the Royal Society has been working with an organisation called the CRAC to look at essentially who's applying for their university research fellowships and the Dorothy Hodgkins fellowships and so on. And what they found is that, let's say approximately 6% of the general postdoctoral researcher pool from where we might be drawing our applicants, about 6% of those identify as having a disability. But in the case of the URFs, only about 4% of applicants have a disability. So you could say that disabled people are underrepresented there. But on the other hand, with the Dorothy Hodgkins Fellowship, it's actually 13% identify as having disability. So in some ways, there's an overrepresentation. And so that itself is very interesting to understand why that is. What is it about the Dorothy Hodgkins that is attracting more disabled people to apply? Is it that that scheme is thought to be more flexible? Actually, both schemes are very flexible. The URF has become more flexible in that sense. Um, so, uh, so there may be an issue of just talking to people and explaining those schemes slightly more clearly, so that people realize the URF is not something to be afraid of in that sense. In terms of the future, well, I know that the Royal Society is working on some issues now and will be putting together a new package of what it offers in terms of supporting disabled people through the process and various accommodations, not only in the application phase, but also once if they win an award, what the Royal Society can do to support them additionally once they're doing their research.
Right.
That is going to be announced, I think, early in 2026. Personally, one of the things I'm interested in is a sort of the idea of a free text box, which you see on various funding schemes to some extent. Sometimes it's a little bit narrow and it's about actual whole chunks of time away from your research career, but something where someone can explain their background circumstances so that reviewers can take a holistic view of that person, not only what research they've done, but the circumstances under which they've done that research. And that I think is something worth seriously considering.
Great. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's something that we really should be following up with. It's something we can do now, and certainly really encouraged by the package that you were mentioning in terms of for applicants and grant holders. So thank you very much, Paul. Really super presentation there.
Thank you.
Whilst we pass to our next speaker, I'll just encourage anyone who would like to put a question to Paul or any of the other speakers, please do so at any point, just using that Q&A function just at the bottom of your screens if possible. Great, so we'll keep going through the agenda now, and I'd like to introduce Leonie Jones, who's the Employability and Diversity Officer at the University of York, and is also a past member of the Royal Society of Chemistry Inclusion and Diversity Committee. So Leonie, please to have you here, and I'll pass to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elise. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about this work, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Royal Society of Chemistry's report. So for me, this work is it's deeply personal. I guess both as a disabled chemist managing a chronic health condition, but also working in a chemistry department with so many talented disabled staff and students. So you can really see the power and the impact of this type of work. So this is a real roadmap, as you say, to enable our community to deliver meaningful change that really has the potential to be, as we say, hugely impactful. For me in particular, it's kind of the really early experiences of lab accessibility can really significantly shape the career choices of disabled chemists. And I see that in my role as Employability and Diversity Officer. So where those experiences are positive, proactive, constructive, where individuals feel thought about and supported, this can make such a real difference in ensuring that we do retain a diverse workforce and that we avoid those leaks that we saw earlier in the data. And for me, this is all about mindset. So as Elise mentioned in her presentation, taking concrete actions is really pivotal to ensure that disabled talent can really flourish in science. And that meaningful change requires a community-wide effort, so that's something that we all need to contribute for. So as part of the report, there's a series of recommendations for key stakeholders. The report identifies 5 groups that can make meaningful changes to improve inclusion in chemistry laboratories in particular. So the first being disabled lab users, their managers or perhaps supervisors. The second being non-disabled lab users. The third being building managers, facilities managers, heads of department, health and safety staff. You know, the real, I guess these people are really sometimes gatekeepers for some of this. And these are really important roles. And then perhaps more broadly, policymakers and funders, and then organizational culture leads. So really, I'm sure that all of us can identify with perhaps at least one of those groups. And so I encourage you really to all read the RSC report to look at the specific actions that are recommended for each of those groups to take. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So in the interest of time today, I'm just going to pick out one of those key groups, and I'm going to look at disabled lab users and their managers and supervisors. So for members of this group, it's really important, that we require clear guidance on the processes for those adjustments and for available support. And I think Paul touched on that briefly as well. It's a really key thing to encourage individuals to engage with the staff networks, the peer support for advocacy. But for me, also, it's about community building and really trying to reinforce that sense of belonging. And I think that's a really important part of that piece of work. And also to participate in co-design, in advisory roles, to shape these inclusive lab environments. But where this happens, it's really important for us to remember that that time, that expertise needs to be properly recognised and potentially to be recompensed as well. As we talked about, Paul mentioned the disability tax as well. And I think this often feeds into this as well. Next slide, please. Excellent. So while these actions might seem a bit abstract, we're aware that there are many really great examples of good practice that are led by members in our community. And one main aim of this project was to create a repository of centralised knowledge, of practical examples, to create more inclusive laboratory spaces. So the RSC has created a living library of case studies that showcase good practices within the community that make our laboratories more accessible. And again, I really encourage you to take a look at the library and importantly to submit any relevant examples that you have. This is a really key thing for us. And I think this is, for me, almost the most important point is that there's a huge amount of really good practice that's going on in the community. And it's really important for us all to come together and to share that and to pool that knowledge. That's really so powerful. So if we pick out one example of one of the case studies included the library, this touches on accommodating a student doing forensic lab work. So right from the beginning, a proactive and inclusive enrolment process meant that the student was encouraged to feel comfortable in sharing information about their dyslexia and also some mobility issues right from the very start of their time at the university. And the key thing here is that, this was about signalling that it was a safe environment to share this information, and that information was going to be used to support them. The lecture involved customised the standard operating procedure documents as part of the lab exercise by doing things like adjusting the background contrast settings, the font sizes to make the text easier to read. They also provided a specific type of chair in the lab and positioned the student close to the facilities such as the toilets. And, these can be quite simple things, but this can really help to reduce the impact of the mobility barriers experienced within the lab. In addition, the student was offered extra time to complete the assessment. And as a result of these relatively simple interventions, the student was able to complete the lab assessment and really pleasingly without using any of that additional time that was offered, that was there as a bit of a safety buffer. So we've picked out this example and you can see it's a relatively set of small, simple changes And again, it's one of those things where having the bandwidth to think about these and sharing good practice is really powerful. And for me, it's also about creating that culture of psychological safety as well, for people to be able to talk to each other about this and to judge whether you can safely share this information with the people that are there to support you. Next slide, please. So as we saw in the example, these small practical changes can be really effective in improving lab users' experiences. They can also be really relatively cost effective, relatively cheap. And so that's something that came out in the RSC research as well. So when asking participants for their most common physical adjustments in the labs, the most frequent responses were things like step-free access, mat bench surfaces, wide walkways with decent sized turning spaces, lever handled taps. And when asked about adjustments that were not available, but that they would consider useful, ergonomic workspaces, modified lab procedures, and enlarged text on labels were amongst the most frequent answers. And I certainly identify with the needing the large text. I think that's something that, some of these things are a no-brainer, and I think they would just be so useful for everybody. So for me, this evidence really demonstrates that there are already lots of things that we can all be doing to make our labs more accessible. Next slide, please. Okay. So just before handing over, I just want to flag up a really fantastic scheme which the RSC offers to support disabled chemists beyond the laboratory environment, and that is the RSC Accessibility Grants, which I've made use of myself. The scheme is funded by the Chemistry Community Fund, and it's specifically designed to provide financial support and to reduce accessibility challenges for individuals attending chemistry-related meetings, such as a conference, a workshop, or a professional development event. So hopefully there are people on this webinar today that can benefit from the grant, as one of those concrete resources that is already available for professional development. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. Again, another super presentation and really full of practical advice there. I just wondered if time just for a quick question from myself here. I'm just interested to kind of know your opinion in terms of, from your experience, what's been the most helpful or, effective change that you've implemented in the department? What's really made a difference?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. So for us, one of the really common challenges that we've been seeing in our teaching labs, but also in our research labs, is around sensory overload due to noise in labs. So that's really common to do with things like pump noise, fume hood noise, the acoustics of lots of people discussing science. And so a group of my colleagues have been piloting the use of loop earplugs. So that's a passive noise reduction device. And this has really been a partnership between a series of our academic disability officers, our health and safety colleagues, and central health and safety and disability kind of student services staff as well. And it's because there were concerns over, for example, wearing headphones in a lab or wearing earplugs might reduce the ability of wearers to perceive hazards around them, which is obviously really important in a lab. And so staff were able to work collaboratively with the health and safety staff to test devices out, to write procedures, and to get agreements put into place that these particular earplugs could be used in these circumstances. And we used the student support plans, which is, I guess, like our student passport, as a way of getting that agreement, and we're now looking at broadening that out. So rather than me explaining, I've got some student feedback here, which I kind of picked out recently, which is Since I've been wearing my loop earplugs in labs, I've noticed a huge difference in my lab experience. I don't get as overwhelmed by the end of the day, and I notice I make fewer mistakes and my focus is better. So for me, that's a really incredible, tangible impact. And the key kind of structural barriers that we see. So I guess there are two for me. The one is the infrastructure, the physical structure of the building, the fact that those noises, are difficult to engineer out. And the other one is the procedural barriers, the policy barriers. And I guess there are those kind of two key things. And the ingredients for success were, I suppose, an open can-do culture, and creating that sort of psychological safety for individuals to feel that they could come and talk to colleagues and try and work this out. So it's a real team effort, and I should say big thank you to our academic disability officers, so Julia Sardu, Lizzie Wielden, Stephen Cowling, our health and safety officer, Lawrence Abbott, and our central health and safety and university disability staff, who over a number of years have got this policy up and running. And so this is a really nice thing. But I guess I should say it's an example of an adjustment, but in an ideal world, we want to have some kind of universal design principles that do engineer these things out from the beginning. And obviously that is the best thing for everybody.
Oh, thank you. That's excellent. I think I'll be following up on the loop earplugs for laboratories in my organisation there. I think that'd be very useful. But certainly designing out is where we need to be heading. So thank you so much. That's super. I'd just like now to move to our last speaker of the day, and this is Hamied Haroon. So Hamied is a research scientist in medical imaging physics at the University of Manchester, and he's also the chair of the National Association of Disabled Staff Networks. So super to have you on the webinar today, and I'll just pass straight to yourself. Thank you, Hamied. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elise. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's coming out clear.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. It is wonderful to be on this webinar this afternoon with these two fabulous reports, opening up science, hopefully, to us as disabled people. So, as well as being a research scientist at the University of Manchester and chair of the wonderful NADSN community, I am also a member of the Royal Society's Diversity and Inclusion Committee and the subgroup for disabled scientists, along with Paul, which is a fantastic privilege, and it's been wonderful to be part of the Open Inclusion Project for the Royal Society's report. What's been really nice is how the report refers to the NADSN STEM Action Group's problem statement and the more recent white paper we published from our group around moving STEM to become more fully inclusive of disabled people as we kind of progress forward. So I've been asked to talk about culture and about networks in the report. Two of my favorite things, probably networks more favorite than the other. So what is a culture? A culture is a set of norms. It's a set of values that are unwritten, but we learn about. We learn what those values are and how people expect us to behave in certain ways from different cultures. So in my own culture, being a Pakistani, food and music and the way that we respect our elders, for example, are all part of that culture. So culture exists in our departments as well. And creating an inclusive culture can transform the experience of disabled scientists throughout their careers, which is why it's so important that we work together to support positive change. And this involves making a conscious effort to cultivate a supportive environment, placing greater value on quality rather than the quantity of work that we're doing. And this relates to metrics and how we're measured on our performances. Ensuring clear communication on how disabled scientists will be supported and leading into the social model of disability, and away from the deficit or medical model of disability, and proactively offering adjustments at all career stages, but also standardizing the inclusive communication we need across the organization. So I'm going to dwell on this a little. So as the report says, an inclusive research culture is foundational, and it's so important that that culture adopts the social model of disability, where it's the barriers, those negative attitudes and exclusionary practices that are what make us disabled, as Elise very wonderfully illustrated at the beginning of this webinar. And the medical model is where we're the problem, so we need to move away from that and to the social model. Departmental culture has a profound impact on disabled scientists. It can either create workplace barriers if it's a negative culture, or it can enable effective and inclusive working conditions. So some of the negative cultures can value long working hours, can expect us to be present physically all the time, and these expectations create barriers. They disproportionately affect disabled scientists, negatively impacting our health and well-being, and they just lead us to feeling overwhelmed. If there's inconsistent messaging in the department, this creates a fragmented experience. There's an impact on confidence of disabled scientists from that kind of messaging, and it signals that disabled inclusion is not a consistent priority. There can also be hierarchical power dynamics at play, and these kind of promote narrow academic values based on traditional productivity metrics. And additional cultural attitudinal challenges can be there when intersected with race, gender, etc. So there's a really profound quote in the Open Inclusion report that really struck me. Somebody actually had to quit their job from science after 3 years of dealing with discrimination and exclusion. And they said, I'm a second-class citizen as a woman. I'm a second-class citizen as a person of color. And I'm a third-class citizen as a disabled person. That really sums up the impact of such negative culture on people. And the worst thing, that people quit. They have to leave. They can't deal with that. So we have damaging attitudes, unrealistic inflexibility, and a lack of visibility on disability inclusion. Positive cultures, on the other hand, when it comes to good practice, can be proactively inclusive, or they are proactively inclusive. They empower, they're empowered by leadership attitudes and behavior. And here, leadership is key. There has to be buy-in, support, and action, real action from senior leadership within a STEM department and the institution to essentially build, progress, and sustain inclusive cultures. Disclosure as well can be a horrible thing. Just the word disclosure or declaration itself is a word that makes us think that we've got some kind of criminal record we're hiding. But a supportive culture can reduce the stress and concern with sharing about your disability or your neurodivergence or a chronic illness and requesting the accommodations we need. That encourages trust, psychological safety, as Leonie was talking about, support emotional resilience for everybody. And that inculcates respect and adaptability across team differences and diversity, including disability. Environments that enable disabled scientists to thrive, contribute meaningfully, and then be recognized for the full value of their expertise. This removes barriers, encourages a sense of value and belonging. And yeah, flexible working becomes a norm, which is what we saw in the pandemic, that flexible working was for everybody. It opened up possibilities, opportunities, made things so much more accessible during that time. But now we seem to be going backwards again. So inclusive cultures are ones where colleagues interact with understanding, compassion, and empathy, and ask. And there's peer-to-peer allyship there. So let's move on to networks. Sorry if I'm taking too much time here, but supporting successful disabled staff networks creates a culture of change. So establishing disabled scientist networks can create a sense of belonging, and well-supported networks can effectively inform policies and practice. Because there, you're not alone in these networks. You're a collective. You have a voice. Successful networks are safe spaces to share lived experience, provide and receive support, and seek guidance from peers. The involvement from senior leadership is really essential. Having somebody who can take those concerns, take those issues that come up, take them up to the highest levels of the university where things can be dealt with and changed, but but involving us in those discussions, in those ways of positive change. Networks should welcome all disabled people, including people with visible and invisible, fluctuating and other conditions, as well as neurodiversity, is so very important to make our disabled staff networks really inclusive in the best way. So in terms of networks, they do offer that valuable peer support and advocacy, but they don't exist everywhere. Where they do exist, they can be a safe space, a space where we can openly discuss lived experiences, where there's mutual support, where there is that sense of belonging, where we can share knowledge, we can signpost each other to information and resources and help. And they can be vehicles for disability advocacy and activism. They are where disabled people can be seen and heard. They can also do great things like facilitate mentorship opportunities, for example, in career development opportunities out there. I think that's all I want to say on this, except so there's also a quote from the report around this. For me, having the Disabled Scientist Network has been life-changing, because you're not on your own anymore. You don't have to pretend like everything's fine. And that kind of sums things up really, really nicely. I would encourage people to also go for the more national networks we have within, like the National Association of Disabled Staff Networks, where we can share experiences across institutions, across the sector as well, and raise our voices on the national level and make change happen there too. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Hamied. That was excellent. Really, really informative. And, I do think it's vital and really, important that the Royal Society has emphasised the importance of an inclusive culture. Again, just a quick question before we go to the Q&A. In terms of, from your experience, what actions in particular do you think has really delivered success around getting that positive, inclusive culture embedded? What do you think has, in particular, made things more successful than others?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I think embedding an inclusive culture within our university, at the University of Manchester, one brilliant initiative that Professor Jackie Carter started up at our university was a Let's Talk Disability podcast conversations, where Jackie has been pairing up a disabled member of staff at the university, whether a scientist or from other disciplines, with a senior member of staff, so a senior leader in their area, and having a very frank recorded conversation about the experiences that disabled colleague has every day at work in their own life, managing not just work and life, but disability as well. And that senior leader listening to that has made a huge impact. The first thing the senior leader often says is, "Really? I didn't know that." And I think just having those conversations, opening those opportunities up to actually share stories, not made up stories, real stories of what we go through on a daily basis, the barriers that we face, and the kind of negative things that we have to deal with on a daily basis, can be an eye-opener for those senior leaders who don't see that, who don't have the experiences we do. So that has been a wonderful way of bringing disability up the EDI agenda as well. Race and gender can often be the leaders, if you like, in EDI, inequality, diversity, and inclusion within the university institutions, because of the charter marks that there are there. And disability can often be a poor cousin. So anything we can do to highlight disability, to bring it up the EDI agenda, if you like, and give it parity, can bring about much more better cultures within our institutions. I think one of the most famous kind of disabled scientists, who was one of the people I looked up to as a kid, as a disabled child, really passionate about science, was the late and great Professor Stephen Hawking, who was himself a fellow of the Royal Society and a brilliant physicist. And without him, we would not have achieved the remarkable insights we now have about black holes and the universe. So the work he did, excuse me, as a disabled person, was because of the support he received. We're not all Stephen Hawking. We're not all going to be privileged in that way, but it just goes to show that the right kind of support, the right kinds of opportunities allow disabled people to contribute to science, because we're passionate about what we do. I hope that's okay.
Super. Yeah, that's excellent. And a huge thank you to all our speakers today. That's Paul, Leonie, and Hamied. It's been really insightful to get your input just now. We're a bit tight on time, but just looking at some of the questions that are coming through, which are really useful. So one of the first ones was asking about specific lab modifications, which are highlighted as high impact, low cost. There is a useful table in the Royal Society of Chemistry report, which you would maybe makes a start at answering that question for you, which really lists some of the lab features that have been made available, and ranks really their usefulness in terms of whether it's helped or not. So I think that would be a good place to start in terms of getting that list together in terms of the particular modifications which have been useful. I don't know if anyone from the panel has anything more to add on particular lab modifications.
I could give you a really quick one. So I guess for me, there's a kind of balance between a quick and dirty sort of adjustment and a universal design solution. So an example of something that would be a challenge. So, for example, We have problems with very bright lights in some of our labs, which people find really difficult. And a really simple, low-cost adjustment there would be the use of tinted lab specs. There are quite a wide variety of those available, and we've had individuals trying out some of those really simple adjustments, which can make a really huge impact, even though that's a really simple thing. And I think somebody asked about kind of universal design as well. And a slightly different example there would be that one of the things that our wonderful teaching labs trialed was, instead of everyone walking in the lab at 9 o'clock on the dot, to have a window, a much longer window where everybody can move into the lab at their own pace. It means that you don't have that rush all at once. You don't have a big noisy crowd. It means that people who want to get there early and get started can do. It means that people who are need a bit of time to get going in the morning can do that as well. And so again, that's something that benefits everybody. It's helpful particularly for neurodivergent individuals or people with perhaps mobility issues, where the crowd is difficult. So I think sometimes it is about taking a step back and thinking, do we really need to do these things in this way? Can we do things differently? And I think those are probably good starting points. But I think looking at the library of case studies is probably then the next place to look. And if there's things that aren't there, please do submit those. We're really excited to hear everybody's ideas and suggestions.
It's great, thank you. And just sort of conscious of the time, so I'll maybe move to sum up now, but also sort of pick out some of the points from the question here in terms of what would you like the future to look like for disability inclusion. And I think from both of the reports that have come through, what we're driving for is accessibility, which is built into every aspect of laboratory design. An inclusive culture is part of everyday laboratory life, and disabled people are empowered and influential within laboratories, within particular disabled scientist networks, offering valuable peer support and advocacy. And also very much allyship and shared responsibility, to be able to strengthen inclusion, and also, as called out in particular in the Royal Society report, the line managers really providing that pivotal support. And ultimately looking for systems and policies that sustain lasting accessibility and inclusion, which also, as we've discussed already, extends to funders. So it really is about building, in terms of the future direction, building accessibility into every aspect of laboratory design, both now with things that you can do, practical steps today, as well as looking at future design areas, and then supported by in the inclusive culture systems and policies. So do please have a look at both of the reports, really useful information. And also in the chat here is a number of other links as well, that again should provide some helpful information for you. And also please feel free to contact both the Royal Society of Chemistry and Royal Society teams as well, for any particular areas you'd like to look at further. So we'll just bring the webinar to a close now. I really appreciated the talks that we had this afternoon. And again, thank you to the speakers, thank you to the organisers, and thank you very much for joining the webinar today. Okay, thank you. Bye.